First question is, according to the Leviathan video, Hobbes believed that a state of nature would eventually turn into a state of...
Welcome to the Macat Multimedia Series, a Macat analysis of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. What does it mean to be truly free? Is it living in a world where you are able to go about your life as you wish, without oppression or tyranny from others? It sounds fair, but is the reality of individual freedom more complicated than that? In 1651, philosopher Thomas Hobbes published a book called Leviathan that laid out an opposing theory. Hobbes suggested that a world with absolute personal freedom, something he called the state of nature, would inevitably become violent and brutish. He thought that this state of nature would eventually become a state of war.
All right, so that is number one, a state of war. Essentially, like it's a domino effect. If one person, if you steal something from one person, then you go and steal it back, and then they're like, all right, me and my friend are coming over there, and now we're going to steal all your stuff, and it just goes back and forth and escalates. All right. According to the Leviathan video, to prevent crashes, drivers could give up some of their freedom to drive however they want by creating laws telling them how to drive. They could put someone in charge to make sure drivers would follow those laws. True or false?
To explain, let's consider a newly built city. This city has no traffic lights and no driving legislation. There is one driver who is free to drive around as he wishes. This is Hobbes' state of nature. More drivers move to the city. They are all free to drive from place to place however they want to. Crashes start to occur. Slow drivers weave in front of fast drivers, and parked cars obstruct access to the streets. The freedom of one driver to drive wherever or however he wants begins to impinge on the freedom of another to do the same. The city's roads are now in Hobbes' so-called state of war. Hobbes proposes that the solution to the state is creating a civil society with a Leviathan, someone who is in charge to preside over the conduct of its citizens. In the case of our imaginary city, traffic lights are put in place, rights of way are established, and laws are drawn up. A traffic enforcer becomes the Leviathan and would hold authority over drivers to enforce the law. As a result, drivers will now be able to use the city's roads without crashes or obstructions. Although individual freedom has been compromised, drivers enjoy more protection and better social order.
All right, so this is true. Right, yeah. So basically, if you make certain laws, it will kind of create order, and things will flow better. You could also say, like, how if you're walking down the hallway, by walking on the right side every time, you're kind of splitting it in half, and that way you're not running right face first into somebody else who decides to walk on the opposite side of the hallway. If you do run into each other, then it becomes the person who is not following the rules. It becomes their fault versus the person who is following the rules.
How? If there are no rules, there were no rules in that video.
No, I'm saying after. So after you create the rules. So in the beginning, right, when there weren't any, when they were in crashes and stuff, right, you'd be right. So when they were crashing and everything, since there are no rules, it's either everybody's at fault or nobody's at fault. Either way, one or the other, because you're right, there are no rules. Afterwards, once they make the rules and you've got the person to enforce them, then it becomes the person who's not following the rules where the fault is. So And then we have traffic accidents and everybody's late to work and it sucks. Okay. Oh.
Hobbes saw the organization of individual liberty by king or queen with the absolute power to create laws as a pragmatic and rational way to sustain a moral world. He believed that humans entered into this hierarchical society because they realized it was within their interest to do so. Hobbes' Leviathan was published amidst the chaos and violence of the Civil War in Britain, a time where political, social, and scientific structures were in a constant flux. It played an important part in the formation of social contract theory and remains an important text in the history of ideas. A more detailed explanation of his ideas.
Alright. So this one is, according to the Leviathan video, Hobbes preferred democracy to monarchy. That is false. He is the only Enlightenment thinker that will prefer a monarchy to a democracy. Everybody else is going to be for either a democracy / republic. So he's the only one. Okay, so second video in here. Oh, wait, what was the question? I didn't even read it. According to the political theory video, Hobbes was okay, so what kind of person was he? And I did already suggest what kind of person he was before, so...
Thomas Hobbes was a 17th century English philosopher who was on hand to guide us through one of the thorniest issues of politics. To what extent should we patiently obey rulers, especially those who are not very good, and to what extent should we start revolutions and depose governments in search of a better world? Hobbes' thinking is inseparable from one major event that began when he was 64 years old and was to mark him so deeply it coloured all his subsequent thinking. Remarkably, he died when he was 91, and so everything he's remembered for today he wrote after the age of 60. This event was the English Civil War, a vicious, divisive, costly, and murderous conflict that raged across England for almost a decade and pitted the forces of king against parliament, leading to the deaths of some 200,000 people on both sides. Hobbes was by nature a deeply peaceful and cautious man. He hated violence of all kinds, a disposition that had begun at the age of 4.
Alright, so he was very peaceful and cautious, and he hated violence. I'll tell you why in a second, but I didn't want to put this down right away.
Probably something from his childhood.
Oh, you are correct, sir.
Because if you don't like violence, that's probably because you've been scarred as a child.
Probably. Yes. Alright, next question will be, according to the political theory video, the new belief after divine right was that people should only listen to their government if, and this will be this, they were being forced to listen, it was working out well for them, they were peasants, or government officials had the same religion as their subjects. So be ready to hear for that.
When his own father, a clergyman, was disgraced and abandoned his wife and family after he got into a fight with another vicar on the steps of his parish church in a village in Wiltshire. The work for which we chiefly remember Hobbes.
Hang on. So, yeah, that was the scarring event. So not only did this guy his father get into a fight, but he ended up getting disgraced, leaving the family. And of course that's going to be a bigger deal back then because, the father's supposed to be the provider at the time. And so it's going to impact them significantly.
It depends how old he was when his father left. Because if he was young, then of course he's going to be scarred.
Yeah, he was young.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So number 5 would be,
We didn't get there yet.
Leviathan was published in 1651. It is the most definitive, persuasive, and eloquent statement ever produced as to why one should obey government authority, even of a very imperfect kind, in order to avoid the risk of chaos and bloodshed. To understand the background of Hobbes's conservatism, it helps to realize that across Western Europe in the 17th century, political theorists were beginning to ask, with a new directness, on what basis subjects should obey their rulers. For centuries, way back into the Middle Ages, there'd been a standard answer to this, contained in a theory called the divine right of kings. This was a blunt, simple, but highly effective theory, stating that it was none other than God who'd appointed all kings, and that one should obey these monarchs for one clear reason, because God said so, and he would send you to hell if you didn't agree. But this was no longer proving quite so persuasive to many thoughtful people, who argued that the right to rule ultimately lay not with kings, but with ordinary people who gave kings power, and therefore should only expect to take orders from kings, so long as, but only so long, as things were working out quite well for them.
And there was that answer.
I like how it's like, and if you did not comply, then you would not go with God. It's like,
Yeah, exactly. That's what it was, yeah.
so long, we have had this war for about like 23 minutes.
Alright, let's not, I'm recording, so let's not get into it. Alright. This is the important, I guess the more important part. This is the main concept, other than social contract, but this is really like where, well, I'll talk about it after we get to it. Alright, so according to the political theory video, Hobbes believed that people who accused their sovereign of doing wrong things were actually committing treason, wanted another country to rule them, trying to cause anarchy among the nation, at fault themselves, because if they could rule themselves, they wouldn't need a ruler, or just try and take power for themselves.
This was known as the social contract theory of government. Hobbes could see that the divine right of kings theory was nonsense, and what's more, was going to be increasingly unpersuasive as religious observance declined. He himself was, privately, an atheist. At the same time, Hobbes was deeply scared of the possible consequences of the social contract theory, which could encourage people to depose rulers whenever they felt a little unhappy with their lot. Hobbes had received a first-hand account of the beheading of King Charles I on a scaffold in front of the banqueting house at the Palace of Whitehall in 1649, and his intellectual labours were directed at making sure that such ghastly primitive scenes would never be repeated. So, in Leviathan, Hobbes puts forward an ingenious argument that tries to marry up social contract theory with a defence of total obedience and submission to traditional authority. The way he did this was to take his readers back in time to a period he called the state of nature, before there were kings of any kind, and to get them to think about how governments would have arisen in the first place. Key to Hobbes's argument was that the state of nature would not have been a pretty place, because humans, left to their own devices, without a central authority to keep them in awe, would quickly have descended into squabbling, infighting, and intolerable bickering. It would have been a little like the English Civil War, but with people in bearskins bashing each other around with flint tools. In Hobbes's famous formulation, life in the state of nature would have been nasty, brutish, and short. As a result, out of fear and dread of chaos, people were led to form governments. They had done this willingly, as social contract theorists maintain, but also under considerable compulsion, fleeing into the arms of strong authority, which they therefore, Hobbes argued, had a subsequent duty to keep obeying, with only a few rights to complain if they didn't like it. The only right that people might have to protest about an absolute ruler, or Leviathan as Hobbes called him, was if he directly threatened to kill them. However, if the ruler merely stifled opposition, imposed onerous taxes, crippled the economy, and locked up dissidents willy-nilly, this was absolutely no reason to take to the streets and demand a change of government. As Hobbes wrote, though of so unlimited a power men may fancy many evil consequences, yet the consequences of the want of it, which is perpetual war of every man against his neighbour, are much worse. He admitted that a ruler might come along with an inclination to do wicked deeds, but the people would still have a duty to obey this person, as human affairs cannot be without some inconvenience. But this inconvenience is anyway the fault of the people, not the sovereign, because, as Hobbes adds, if men could rule themselves, there would be no need at all of a common coercive power. As he went on, he that complaineth of injury from his sovereign complaineth of that whereof he is the author himself, and therefore ought not to accuse any man but himself.
So to kind of relate this a little bit more to modern day, I guess, in a sense, if you look at, all right, let's envision the classroom as the goal is to learn something, right? That's the goal. That's why you're there. Otherwise, you just essentially stay at home, which in regular, let's ignore the COVID thing. Let's just talk about it in general. Hobbes would say that it would be better to have a teacher that is mean and terrible than not to have one at all. Because if you didn't have one, it would end up being chaos. People would end up fighting each other. They wouldn't end up learning anything. They'd probably turn tables around. They'd be all over the place. And essentially, whatever the goal was wouldn't get done. Somebody might steal something from somebody. All of a sudden, one person gets their pencil stolen. Now people are like, oh no, they took my stuff. Oh, prove it. And it turns into a bunch of a mess. So what he's saying is it's better to have like a teacher that might be either mean or sucks or whatever than to have no one. And basically, if you could essentially govern yourself and make yourself like sit down and learn and not interact with other people in a distracting whatever way, like in a controlled way, then you wouldn't need this authority. But since you can't do that, you need that there to make the goal happen, essentially. All right, so this last one answer is this one. At fault themselves because they could rule themselves, because if they could rule themselves, they wouldn't need a ruler. So if they could teach themselves, they wouldn't need a teacher. All right, as I'm gonna let this finish, it's almost done, as you guys hit submit.
Hobbes' theory was dark, cautious, and not especially hopeful about government. In our more optimistic moments, we want him to be wrong, but it seems Hobbes' name will always be relevant and fresh again when revolutions, motivated by a search for liberty, go horribly awry. Hobbes maintained in the preface to Leviathan that he had written the book without partiality, without application, and without other design than to set before men's eyes the mutual relationship between protection and obedience.